We are the land.
This is dedicated to our relatives before us, thousands of years ago.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is a responsive discussion related to the both black and white Hebrew Israelites. We are going to be discussing the relationship between those entities and the transatlantic slave trade. That is also, of course, related to the trans Saharan slave trade. Now, many of these individuals have been insisting for a very long time, at least a century now, that they are the true descendants of Abraham, entitled to these Abrahamic birthrights. What's noteworthy about this is that these are the same entities that appear to be central to the transatlantic slave trade. And this transatlantic slave trade involved over 36,000 slave voyages in terms of that triangular trade, and then an additional 31,000 slave voyages inside of the Americas. Now, what's noteworthy about this is that oftentimes the claims of these entities have been ignored, but what we're going to do is we're going to accept their claims of identity, and we're going to look at this dynamic with respect to the transatlantic slave trade and also the relationship between all of this and scripture. Now, if we take these narratives and put them together, the black Hebrew Israelite narrative and the white Hebrew Israelite narrative, also known as Anglo Israelism or Brit Israelism. So, if we put all of these together and also include African Israelism, specifically related to the west coast of Africa. So, if we put all of this together, what we have in terms of the colonization of the world, we have the descendants of Abraham, and specifically the descendants of Abraham implicated in the trans-Saharan slave trade and the transatlantic slave trade would be essentially the descendants of Ishmael and the descendants of Isaac. And so those two sons, specifically, those descendants. And so then with respect to Isaac, we specifically have the sons of Jacob, taking significant credit for this whole dynamic. And so that would include, again, the black Hebrew Israelites and the white Hebrew Israelites, if we are accepting the narrative that they have given us, the way that it has been presented. And so these two entities are not really distinct. They are quite collusive, although identifying in different ways with respect to which tribes go with which groups of people. And so, what we are looking at right now is this dynamic related to the kingdom of Judah on the west coast of Africa. Again, we are going to accept as a given this narrative that has been presented that has tied entities in the Americas to that ancient kingdom of Judah. And so we have a number of individuals identifying as Hebrew Israelites, identifying also as those who were of this kingdom of Judah on the west coast of Africa. This, of course, is noteworthy because the kingdom of Judah on the west coast of Africa was a major primary player in the transatlantic slave trade. And so when these individuals are identifying as the kingdom of Judah, as these Hebrew Israelites, they are identifying as the primary slave traders out of Africa. They are identifying as the entities that captured, enslaved, and deported indigenous people in Africa to various places around the world. They are identifying as the entities that kidnapped, deported, and enslaved these various people in the East Indies. And so this would be those Indian Ocean islands. And so this is very significant. Now, according to the narratives and according to history, we have these entities identifying as the Black Hebrew Israelites or the Hebrew Israelites. Um, they were working collusively with the so-called white Hebrew Israelites who were out of Europe. They were also, according to these narratives, working collusively with the Black Hebrew Israelites that were in Europe. This would include working with those entities identified as Moor. However, we're focusing on this Jacob identity for now and individuals who are taking this narrative onto themselves and the implications for this. Now, clearly, individuals identifying as Hebrew Israelites, whether black or white, and taking on this identity, they have made it easier to better understand what took place in the transatlantic slave trade and the trans-Saharan slave trade and the Indian Ocean slave trade. Because what has been presented now is not that Africans, indigenous Africans, were selling themselves or each other into slavery. What has been presented is that the descendants of Abraham were deporting people, enslaving people, and sending them across the ocean. And so that's also perhaps something that might provide some clarity to individuals who are in Africa who have been confused about the history of this entire dynamic. And when looking at the history, we see that there is this confederacy going on between these entities that were stationed on the west coast of Africa, who are identified as Hebrew Israelite, and their apparent cousins up north in Europe. And so they appear to have been working in collaboration according to the narratives of the Hebrew Israelites themselves and also looking at history. Now, what we are noting with respect to the transatlantic slave trade on the west coast of Africa, we are noting that that kingdom of Judah was involved in over 1,100 slave voyages between the 1500s and the 1800s. And so just that area alone, that Ouida, was involved in, again, over 1,100 slave voyages over the span of centuries. We are going to identify the specific entities who identify as the Kingdom of Judah from the west coast of Africa. And so, in other words, the entities that are taking responsibility for the Kingdom of Judah on the west coast of Africa and identifying themselves as the entities that were involved in these 1,104 slave voyages. And so we're going to be looking at those entities with respect to those that are in the Americas in current times. Now, of course, this correlates with entities that are still on the west coast of Africa who are not, according to their narratives, actually Africans. They are identifying as the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, before we get into that, we're going to consider some spiritual implications for these identities and these claims. And so, with respect to these claims that have been made, wherein individuals in the Americas and on the west coast of Africa are identifying as the Kingdom of Judah, These entities have placed themselves, according to their own narratives and admissions, they have placed themselves squarely into this interesting book of Revelation. Now, often you will hear entities refer to the book of Revelation and Babylon and all of that. But what has happened with these identities that have been taken on, whether they are real or perceived, these identities that have been taken on as the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and this kingdom of Judah on the west coast of Africa, this major slave trading kingdom. What has happened is that individuals have now, collectives have now, placed themselves into the book of Revelation, specifically at Revelation 17 and 18. And so, in other words, they have positioned themselves according to their own narratives as that which is synonymous with Babylon mystery. Okay, and so I encourage you to look at Revelation 17 and 18, and you will see exactly what I am talking about with respect to these claims that are being made by these entities that are identifying as the kingdom of Judah. Now, I want to point something out that might not be clear to people. The kingdoms that were under Jacob were the kingdom of Judah and the kingdom of Israel. These were distinct kingdoms with distinct kings, but when you put them all together, you have these 12 tribes or 13 tribes or however many tribes based upon how you might be counting these tribes. And so the kingdom of Judah was understood as the southern kingdom. And the kingdom of Israel, also known as the lost tribes, but it's really just the dispersed tribes, or if you look at what the entity known as Jesus referred to them as the destroyed tribes. And so, with respect to these 10 northern tribes, interestingly, these Hebrew Israelites, both white and black, were stationed in Europe. Now, what's noteworthy is that the entities that identify as the kingdom of Judah also recognize these cousins, if you will, in Europe. And they identify themselves as being related to these cousins in Europe who were sitting on these various thrones. This includes King James 6 and 1. So let's get started with the first part of this 1104 discussion. When looking at the slave voyages database that is now maintained by Harvard, by the way, we see that there were 36,000 plus slave voyages going across the Atlantic. We also see over 31,000 slave voyages going within the Americas. Now, all of this was taking place, according to these records, between 1514 and 1866. The question is, why? Why were individuals and collectives of individuals and countries and nation states involved in transplanting, transporting, stealing 36,000 slave voyages full of people and 31,000 slave voyages full of people? Why was this taking place? And even better than that, in terms of questions, who was doing this?
We are the land. This is dedicated to our relatives before us, thousands of years ago.
Now, of course, if you read the book of Revelation 17 and 18, you will see very clearly when you look at the historical narratives that go along with this entire dynamic, you will see very clearly how these various entities, these 12 or 13 tribes, fit very squarely right there. And this, again, is related to how individuals have identified themselves and also historical narratives. And I'm talking about standard historical narratives related to the transatlantic slave trade and related to the conquest, the doctrine of conquest and the doctrine of discovery that part of this collective were operating under. And so there has been this focus on blaming the Vatican. And yes, the Vatican was definitely instrumental in this dynamic. However, these entities that identify as the 12 or 13 tribes of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, these entities also identify themselves as being entitled to the world. Entitled to run the world, entitled to reign over everyone. And so it's not just the popes with the papal bulls that were administering this entire dynamic. And so, with respect to this kingdom of Judah, the entities that have identified themselves as this kingdom of Judah in the Americas include the priesthood for the kingdom of Judah, known as Levi, also known as Louis or the Lion. And these entities are the Haitians. And so the entities that are identifying as the tribe of Levi, this priesthood, these would be the Haitians primarily, okay? And also, this would include those that have been left behind in Ouida or Benin or Nigeria. Okay, and so these people collectively comprise this priesthood. And if you recall, there was a time when Nigeria had the Solomon symbol as a part of heraldry. Okay. And then we have the tribe of Benjamin. The tribe of Benjamin is a part of the kingdom of Judah. And so when there was this breaking off, these various tribes went in different directions. Okay, so with respect to the kingdom of Judah, there is this tribe of Benjamin that is a part of the kingdom of Judah. And specifically with respect to the kingdom of Judah and this tribe of Benjamin, these entities are identified as and identify themselves as the Jamaicans. And so the Jamaicans are the other collective after the Haitians that are in this kingdom of Judah. Then you have the Dominicans. This would be the entities that are identified as or identifying themselves as Simeon. Okay, it's important to note, however, that all Jamaicans are not identifying as Benjamin, all Haitians are not identifying as Levi, and all Dominicans are not identifying as Simeon. However, these are the identities that various people within those collectives are taking on. This is the identity that they are asserting. And the ringleader of all of this would be the entities identifying as Judah, the tribe of Judah. And these entities go by titles such as Black Americans, Negroes, and African Americans. And so the kingdom of Judah is named after, if you will, this particular collective of people. Also remember that the name Judah is spelled and pronounced in many ways. You have Yehuda in some etymology ways of looking at things. You also have Yehuda being tied to Yahweh and Jehovah. Okay, and so they are very much intermingled there when you look at it. Now we also have So that's the kingdom of Judah. And the kingdom of Judah, again, was operating with this collective that identify themselves as the northern kingdom. They identify as Israel, these Brit Israelists, or these Anglo Israelists, if you will. And so, interestingly, their narratives actually hang together, and there was significant interchange going on between these entities in Europe and these entities in Africa. So much so that there are some narratives about these monarchs in Africa sending their children to school in Europe, having European kings and queens be the godparents of their children. This narrative always sounded strange, but when you take it in this context of these 12 or 13 tribes, perhaps there is some foundation that most of us, are not aware of with respect to this very interesting dynamic. And so, again, so we have this kingdom of Judah. And these are the entities, according to the identities that they are taking on now, these are the entities that were instrumental in the transatlantic slave trade. These are the entities, the Haitians, the Jamaicans, the Dominicans, and the African Americans, Black Americans, Negroes. These are the entities in the Americas who orchestrated, according to their identification, they orchestrated the transatlantic slave trade coming out of the kingdom of Judah, Ouida, the Bight of Benin, all of that, Bight of Biafra. They orchestrated the transatlantic slave trade from that particular space. Before we look at the data, I want to point out something related to this apparent confederacy. There are multiple entities that have suggested, asserted that the 10 dispersed or lost tribes of Jacob were in Europe and that they were on the thrones of various sovereigns in Europe. This is noteworthy because they are also known as the Northern Kingdom. Okay, so those 10 northern tribes, they are known as the Northern Kingdom. And that particular kingdom was known as Israel. Okay, this is all Jacob. It's just that the descendants were broken up into these two kingdoms. The other kingdom was known as the Southern Kingdom. And interestingly, there have been assertions that the entities that comprise the Southern Kingdom of Jacob, that they were situated on the west coast of Africa. And so geographically, it has been noted that the 10 northern tribes are literally north of the southern tribes. And the southern kingdom is known as the Kingdom of Judah. Interestingly, these are the entities that were running the transatlantic slave trade. These are also the entities that were involved in the colonization of the Americas. Now, if you are familiar with the slave voyages narratives, you also know that these kingdoms on the west coast of Africa were working in collusion with apparently their cousins who were in Europe. And so they had this triangular trade dynamic going on. And it not only included an Atlantic trade, these entities were off into the Indian Ocean islands. enslaving people and then transporting them to the Americas. And so these cousins in Europe were main players in this entire situation. Now, it's important to keep in mind that the entities that were in Europe were not all light. Many of them were dark. The same thing applies to those who were on the west coast of Africa. Some of them were dark and some of them were light. According to the narratives, however, they were all cousins. And they were all working together to enslave various people in various parts of the world and to colonize people in various parts of the world. And interestingly, there are tribes, these Isaac tribes, these Jacob tribes, that go along with the various countries in parts of Europe. And so this was a very concerted, coordinated effort going on with respect to the slave trade. What's interesting, however, is what appears to have taken place when many of the entities made it into the Americas as their permanent location. Now, there has been quite a bit of back and forth in terms of the research on this particular topic. However, many individuals are pretty steadfast about this ancestral narrative. And so we're just going to go with the ancestral narrative and also the histories that have been provided. And so essentially, what is going on with respect to the narratives that we have been provided is that those who were identifying as Hebrew Israelite African American were the ringleaders of the transatlantic slave trade. Okay, so what we have here is this book, and it is about Earth and its inhabitants, and we've looked at this before, and this is related to Africa, this particular installment. And this was published in 1888. Now, this entry in this text provides some clarification related to this identity of Judah and this name Judah. And this is under the section on Dahomey. It indicates east of Great Popo begins the Dahomey territory, guarded by the important town of, this is also pronounced Gliwi, known to Europeans by the various names of Fida, Huida, Wida, Wida, also Judah, as we've discussed before. It goes on to indicate the old writers called this place Judah, Juda, without the H at the end. And its inhabitants were said to be Jews, while the neighboring river Alala, whose real name is Ephra, became the Euphrates. And we could see that looking at that old map of the west coast of Africa and that kingdom of Judah. So we saw the desert of Seth, and we also saw, of course, it was Alada was another name that was used for that area. Savi was another name that was used for that area. And of course, we saw, the river. And then again, there's this notation about the Portuguese referring to Judah, Huida, as a Judah. Now, this is interesting because the word a Judah that we found out before does not mean the same thing as this word Judah. Given who the Portuguese were, it stands to reason that they knew this and they knew that there might be some conflation going on, but that's okay. We still have Judah there with respect to this name. What's also noteworthy is that there was a focus in the earlier research, and here you see it mentioned again. There was a focus on this snake, and so there was worship of a deity in this area, in this kingdom of Judah. The worship was of a snake. Now, when one considers that the entities identifying as the Hebrew Israelites identify Haiti as the home of their priesthood, and so the kingdom of Judah identifies the Haitians as the priest class. And with that, we see some narratives and some cultural dynamics with respect to Haiti and incorporating serpents in worship dynamics. And so when you look at it in that context, accepting this identification of Haiti as the Levites, then this narrative about the serpent being central to the worship makes more sense. And here you can see these names more clearly.
We are the land. This is dedicated to our relatives before us thousands of years ago. There's 150.
For this discussion, we're going to be turning our attention back to the Colonial Williamsburg Slavery Remembrance Site. This is a resource that provides significant information related to various aspects of the transatlantic slave trade. And so we're going to be looking specifically at the transatlantic slave trade and very specifically at the activities of what was known as the Kingdom of Judah. If you are new to our discussions, you might not be aware of the fact that we've done extensive research into the transatlantic slave trade and very specifically extensive examination of this kingdom of Judah that goes by many names, as a matter of fact. And so that creates quite a bit of confusion about the exact identity of this particular kingdom. However, there are many people who are laying claim to this kingdom, and so we are going to proceed based upon the claims to the kingdom. And so on this Colonial Williamsburg website, we have the Judah Kingdom spelled O-U-I-D-A-H, so Ouidah. The other spellings are J-U-D-A, J-U-I-D-A, A-J-U-D-A, X-W-E-D-A, H-U-E-D-A. It indicates here Ouidah, also known as Ouidah, and this is with the W-H-Y-D-A-H, is a commercial center in the modern African nation of Benin. That was one of the most active slave trading ports in all of Africa. The article goes on to indicate that there was a definite confederacy going on with respect to Europe and the west coast of Africa. It indicates here that Ouidah's population, or Judah's population, was predominantly African. However, it also indicates only a few hundred European residents lived there through much of the 18th and 19th centuries, while the overall population grew from less than 10,000 to almost 30,000 in the same period. So now let's go back to the Slave Voyages database, and we are looking at transatlantic slavery. There's also part of the database that looks at the intra-American slave trade. And so not going across the Atlantic, but what was going on this side of the Atlantic. And so again, looking at the itineraries, we have 1,104 slave voyages coming out of this kingdom of Judah. Now we're going to look at some data related to the transatlantic slave trade and the kingdom of Judah, kingdom of Ouidah. The data has been compiled for the years 1514 through 1866, and so it covers a few centuries there. What has been noted in the database is that there were approximately 1,104 slave ship voyages from the kingdom of Judah.
We are the land. This is dedicated to our relatives before us, thousands of years ago.
Here we have the breakdown of the number of captives that were sent from the kingdom of Judah. We have, in terms of how many embarked, 405,864. And this is for 1,101 voyages. There's another interesting notation about the enslaved people that disembarked, and it is indicated that 344,322 disembarked. That means that many people were lost in the middle of this. And so that would have been 1,092 voyages. It indicates here that the percentage of enslaved people who died during the crossing amounted to approximately 14%. The percentage of males who had been enslaved and sent from the kingdom of Judah amounted to 61.3%. The percentage of children that were enslaved by the kingdom of Judah amounted to 20.2%. And here you can see the total number of captives and the total number of voyages more clearly. And here you can see a little bit better the duration of the captives crossing. You can see the percentage of male captives more clearly, and you can see the percentage of children captured more clearly. And here we're going to review specific year ranges for the transportation of enslaved people to specific places coming from the kingdom of Judah. And so the kingdom of Judah transported during 1651 through 1675, 459 enslaved people into the Caribbean. 259 individuals went to an unspecified place. From 1676 to 1700, we have over 46,000 going to the Caribbean, 1,074 going to the Spanish mainland Americas. And then in 1701 through 1725, we have the Kingdom of Judah shipping 1,766 enslaved individuals to mainland North America, and then over 100,000 were shipped to the Caribbean, over 9,000 shipped to the Spanish mainland Americas, 17,000, in excess of 17,000 shipped to Brazil. And then in 1726 through 1750, 406 went to Europe. over 900 to mainland North America, 53,000, in excess of 53,000 to the Caribbean again, over 5,000 to Brazil. And you can see the totals over on the right hand side. And so this is for this time period, the Kingdom of Judah shipping to the west for the most part, but then you also see the Europe destination. Okay, continuing on here, we see from 1751 through 1775, Judah shipped over 2,000 to mainland North America, over 48,000 to the Caribbean, over 13,000 to Brazil, and over 1,000 to an unspecified location. From 1776 through 1800, we have over 26,000 going to the Caribbean, over 15,000 going to Brazil. 1801 through 1825, over 3,000 going to the Caribbean, over 10,000 going to Brazil. Another 1,900 going to Africa. This is likely a result of individuals being intercepted and sent to Sierra Leone and Liberia. There was a period when the slave trade had been outlawed, and so the ships were basically diverted and sent back to Africa. And then you have from 1826 through 1850, over 7,000 to the Caribbean, over 10,000 to Brazil, another 6,000, in excess of 6,000 back to Africa. 1851 through 1875, we have over 500 going to mainland North America, over 6,000 to the Caribbean, and then another 690 being diverted essentially back to Africa. Now, of course, what's odd about these narratives is that these collectives of individuals who currently identify as Hebrew Israelite, who currently identify as the entities that were dispatched to engage in this slave trading, these entities currently are identifying as victims of the slave trade that they, according to their narratives, these growing narratives, that they were actually running. And so again, we have the Levites, or people who are identifying as the Levites, and the Haitians. We have those identified as African American, Hebrew Israelites, also identifying as this kingdom of Judah, this slave trading kingdom of Judah on the west coast of Africa. And then there are the Jamaicans, this collective of people who are identifying as Benjamin. And then we have another collective identifying as Dominicans, who are identifying as this tribe of Simeon. All of these entities currently identify as victims of the slave trade. They identify as those who were taken from Africa and transplanted into the Americas, enslaved in the Americas. There seems to be no real clear-cut explanation, however, regarding how they went from being the top slave traders to being the enslaved. Now, what's noteworthy is that entities who are identifying as Hebrew Israelite are taking complete responsibility for this history that includes the kingdom of Judah and this kingdom of Israel during this time period. There are many questions that come up related to this. One question is, are you sure that this is your history? Are you sure that you all were the entities that were commissioned by the Vatican to seek out and destroy people on the west coast of Africa and in the Americas? Are you sure that you all were the ones that were commissioned to enslave all of these Gentile nations? And if you were these people that were doing these things, the question is why? And what are your expectations going forward based upon the behaviors of your ancestors in the past?
We are the land. This is dedicated to our relatives before us, thousands of years ago.
So when considering data such as this, it brings up a number of questions. There are many people who are identifying as this kingdom of Judah, while simultaneously identifying as victims of the kingdom of Judah. It's all very confusing, quite frankly. However, what is noteworthy and deserves significant attention is the repetitive proclamations, the repetitive prophecies about the entities that were involved in the transatlantic slave trade being due judgment. In fact, this scripture from the book of Revelation is often invoked. And you also hear more recently these invocations of judgment related to America. What's noteworthy in all of this apparent projection, is that the prophecies and these conversations and all of these proclamations about judgment leave out a pivotal entity in the entire dynamic. And that entity is this kingdom of Judah that was pretty much the slave trading capital at one point before it was dismantled, apparently, by what would be considered, based upon the lineages, the Fawn people, presumably many people that are in the French-speaking areas currently. And so there's a question about the implications for all of these judgment proclamations. Because according to Scripture, if people are reading Scripture, according to Scripture, Jacob, the descendants of Jacob, are well known for being involved in the slave trade. And the scripture serves as an indictment on that. And here we have another indictment based upon historical record related to this slave trading pattern. And then we have this prophetic word that is frequently used as an indictment for others related to the slave trade. And it touches on this dynamic in what's known as equity. So you have law and you have equity. And one of the things that people need to be on the lookout for when they are pursuing equity is they must have what's known as clean hands. He who seeks equity must do equity. And so you cannot come to equity with unclean hands. You can't come to the judgment of others when you yourself, based upon your own assertions, are due the judgment that you are proclaiming for other people. Now, for those who are unfamiliar with the relevant scripture, and this is just one relevant scripture, the scripture starts off at Revelation 13:9. If any man have an ear, let him hear. He that leadeth into captivity shall go into captivity.
We are the land. This is dedicated to our relatives before us thousands of years ago. There's 150. We are the